Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our sixth Let's Talk About webinar. I'm Siobhan Smith, Lead for Diversity and Inclusion at KTN and Women in Innovation Programme Manager, and it's my honour to introduce our host for today's webinar, Johnny Voon. Johnny is head of the Sustainable Innovation Fund at Innovate UK, a £260 million UK government innovation funding and support programme aimed at helping businesses recover and grow from the COVID-19 pandemic in a clean, sustainable way. Johnny's expertise in R&D funding makes Johnny the perfect person to host today's conversation. And alongside our panelists, they will be discussing how to fund your growth. So over to you, Johnny.
Thank you, Siobhan, and hello, everyone. So today I am joined by three amazing panelists from diverse backgrounds that will give their expert thoughts and opinions on funding your growth. And as Siobhan mentioned, I work for Innovate UK, and a key part of what we do is funding innovative businesses, potentially like yours. So first up, I've got Ruth Mellors-Ray. So Ruth is the director of RMR Consultants, providing objective assistance to navigate the UK's innovation landscape. She has worked across multiple sectors to shape and frame strategic programs and strategies that seek to accelerate innovation through collaboration between industry, government, and academia. Ruth has held positions as the Chief Operating Officer at the Aerospace Technology Institute and Director of the Aerospace, Aviation, and Defense Knowledge Transfer Network to develop a deep understanding of how government and industry work together on innovation agendas. Before moving into aviation, Ruth worked across a range of sectors, including professional services, retail, engineering, and oil and gas, with a focus on change and engagement programs. Ruth is currently a non-executive director of KTN and a trustee of Brooklands Museum. So welcome, Ruth.
Morning.
I'm also joined by Fiona Marston. And Fiona is a biotechnology entrepreneur and partner in RFM Associates, where she provides commercial support to businesses, research organizations, and funds, particularly in the anti-infectives and vaccines fields where she has specialized for almost 20 years and is now very relevant. Until late 2020, Fiona was director of the Center of Excellence in Infectious Diseases Research, focused on translation and commercial partnerships for the University of Liverpool, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and associated NHS trusts. Previously, she was CEO of anti-infective companies, Absinthe Biologics, and Novactor Biosystems, which she co-founded. Earlier in her career, Fiona founded healthcare ventures for the Rothschild Bioscience Unit and J&J Development Corporation, investing in European entrepreneurs. Fiona is a Royal Society entrepreneur in residence for LSTM, an advisor to the seed fund UKI2S, and non-executive director for OBN and Al Hay NHS Foundation Trust. So welcome, Fiona.
Hi.
And last but definitely not least is Celia Young. Celia is currently part of the user engagement team for the Quantum Computing and Simulation Hub, which is part of the UK's National Quantum Technologies Programme. Her multifaceted role includes connecting with the quantum computing supply chain to help shape an inclusive and successful quantum economy for the UK. Celia has extensive experience in research funding, having previously worked for the EPSRC, that's Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, and the University of Oxford's Research Services. So let's talk about funding your growth. So welcome, everyone. So let's start very broadly and just general seeking funding, because I think a lot of the people watching here, some will be used to where they look for funding, but when should you look for things like public funding? You know, people have savings, people have, potential for debt financing and private. Is there ever a right time to look for public funding, and when should they? I mean, Fiona, let's start with you.
So I've funded or raised funding for what are called R&D intensive businesses, and therefore public funding, particularly from UKRI, it is available from very, very early stages right through to quite advanced stages. So I would say there's never a wrong time to look for public funding. The most important thing is to look for the right source of funding for your business at the stage it's at. So for me, it's always about what's the scope of any scheme. So be on the mailing list so that you know which schemes are opening and when, and then look at the scope, because my experience is actually a very positive one. So I have a greater than 90% track record of securing public funding when I've applied. but I've always applied for something where my businesses are in scope. So that would be my first tip.
And Ruth, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, public funding, is it the be all and end all? Is it perfect for every business?
No, absolutely not perfect for every other business. But building on what Fiona was talking about, I think when to look for public funding, particularly Innovate UK funding, is when you've done some research, you've got your idea, and maybe you've got some customers really interested in what you're doing, but you need to be able to just take your idea a bit further. And you might even want to do that with your customer. So I think one of the things about public funding, and particularly Innovate UK funding, is that it can really help you develop your idea in partnership with your customer, and for you to take some slightly bigger risks about what you were doing. So that can bring your idea forward, it can bring your commercial dream forward. And so I think if you wanted to try to do something with others in a collaboration, then Innovate UK collaborative public funding is a great place.
So, I mean, just speaking on that risk there, would you take more risk with public funding than you would say if it were loan or debt financing or savings or, VC private investment? Is that sort of thing?
So I can't talk to the VC world and where those risks are, but because I think they're at different scale, different times of your product development or your technology or innovation development as to, what you're trying to do. But the risk part, I think this is a really critical part of public funding, is that it helps you take a risk without putting all of your own money into that. And it is helping you de-risk some of the businesses. So some of the sectors that I've worked in the aerospace and the aviation community, this risk factor is very important. Aerospace is a business which you have an idea today, it'll be at least 15 years before it ends up on an aircraft. And so for you to be able to start doing that work today, any help you can have to de-risk that decision making, which is where government funding, because you're sharing that cost at 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever it is, really, really helpful.
And actually, so on risk, so Celia, you are in the quantum space, right? And I suppose with quantum, you either get it, you don't, or both. And quantum is one of those things that is inherently seems quite risky because people don't get it. What is that funding landscape like? Do you instinctively go towards public funding because it seems like it understands the benefits of quantum more so than, say, others?
So my expertise is in the earlier career or the earlier part of research, so the earlier TRLs, technology readiness levels. And I guess the experience that I've had is that with the funders who provide the financing to be able to do these small projects, there is an understanding that there are risks. Quite often they can be kind of seed funding or for smaller projects. And I think from my experience, when you get public funding, for example, from UKRI, it's usually to discover which might be the best avenues forwards. And so there's always going to be an element of risk. But from my experience with UKRI funding, they're trying to identify which might be the best players and therefore create a sustainable ecosystem in terms of the research landscape moving forwards.
So this is very much around, and what I'm hearing is that, it is an element of risk. It is an element of, as you say, collaboration, Ruth. It is an element of, in a way, sort of discovery before perhaps you jump down into the further, I guess, more commercial angles, which might be VC, Series A, B, and so forth. But are there strings when it comes to this? And I know, Fiona, looking at the bio side of things, there's a lot of talk now, obviously, of vaccines and the amount of public money that's gone into vaccine research and public vaccine research. Are there strings when it comes to receiving public money from, for example, Innovate UK, other parts of UK research and innovation?
So again, I think, Johnny, it depends on the quantum of money that you're being awarded. So for the smaller grants, they're usually very simple, and your requirement probably is just a report at the end. So here we're talking about tens of thousands, maybe up to low hundreds of thousands. But now there is funding available, particularly in the light of COVID, that is millions. Low millions up to around 10, 20 million is going into some organizations. And so there, obviously, obviously the requirements can be quite stringent. So my experience of very big grants like Strength in Places is that, which comes from the Industrial Strategy Fund, is that the reporting requirements are quite hefty. Metrics, the government is very hefty on metrics, showing that you've created jobs, showing that you've created added value, etc.
This is the value for money, isn't it? The value for money.
Value for money, absolutely. So I would say the more money you're raising, the more the restrictions are, but they're not restrictions that constrain your business. They're more that you probably have to have a full-time project manager, that kind of a situation.
I want to jump in with that as well, because I think there's a lot of strings that we can talk about. And I think one of the things to talk about here as well is that if you're looking at Innovate UK, you have to come with your money too. And I think we need to get that point across quite clearly. So I've spoken to companies who have got lots of venture capitalists in other investors lined up, but those investors won't give them money unless they get the grant. But that's not how Innovate works. Innovate works because you've got some money already in your account, in your business, in your idea, and then you attract more funding from government. And Fiona's absolutely right that some of these programs are about capital. They're about co-investing in a facility. So Drama is an example of an ISC program that I've just been involved in. It's built national facilities, and it now has to show that £14.5 million investment is going to adapt additive manufacturing into the aerospace supply chain. So it will get measured. How many of those companies have gone on to expand into AM? What are their sales going on? So there's a machine. One of the other areas, before I pass back to some of the others, is intellectual property. And I think one of the benefits of Innovate UK funding is the IP is yours. It is not the government's. Now, that isn't the same across all of government. There are different things in, say, the Ministry of Defence, where IP has, some strings attached to it. I think one of the really big things to remember is the IP stays with you. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think, when we look at the longer term objectives, I mean, all three of you are working in spaces that are not, delivering things in 3-6 months, right? It's 3, 6, 12 years, if not sometimes longer. And I think a big part of perhaps looking at this and in terms of private versus public is the longer term objectives. Now, we can easily take a look at aerospace and critics will say, why is the government giving more money to the aerospace industry? And there are longer term objectives, aren't there, Ruth, around cleaner, greener types of flight, electrification, new materials and so forth, and same with the bio and tech side.
Well, aerospace is a big industry in the UK. So employs 250,000 people directly, mostly in very high value, well paid jobs. Check. We want to maintain that. It's an industry that's growing. It's in a lot of pain at the moment because of the pandemic, but it's growing. So we want to be able to make sure that in a growing global market, we not only maintain our position, but potentially grow our position. And it's such an R&D intensive industry that's really important that R&D continues.
Absolutely. Celia, you're going to say something.
Yeah, so I think I'd add to that. So it's not just like you said, the capital, the IP. There are other, I think, softer items you could think about. So it's not just the impacts in terms of output, as in the prototype or a service. It could be things like creating the most appropriate workforce that will enable the maintenance of the sector. So, ED&I, equality, diversity, inclusion are really important. You want to make sure that you have a diverse workforce to ensure that you've got, a complementary group of individuals or groups who are able to provide what the sector needs in the future. And actually, by being open-minded like that, or thinking about things like responsible research and innovation, those then encourage better informed decisions and provide a very comfortable communications route between early research and later research, and that feedback loop that, you can have a conversation saying, I need this, can your lab do that? And vice versa, what do you need? We can provide that. I think those things are also quite important to think about as well.
Yeah, Celia brings in a really important point there as well, because a lot of the Innovate UK funding isn't one-to-one, it's one-to-many. And the value of that one-to-many is you are building relationships for the future. You're building an understanding of supply chains, your customers, your markets. You might be working with somebody who you thought was actually your competitor, but they're not. They're doing something completely different and you need them. So I think those softer angles that Celia's talking about is really important.
I would just also add a slightly separate angle on this, which is if we talk about Innovate UK, very often Innovate UK is funding businesses or business-led money, but UKRI more broadly can be funding academic-led. And that may be academic only, or it may be academic and industry, but academic led. So, and there is a difference because, you know, academics get fully funded. They get 70% of full economic costs, whereas industry, as Ruth has pointed out, usually has to make a contribution depending on the stage. So there can be an advantage to industry to collaborate in academic-led collaborations that seek public funding. And I think that's important to note.
That is one of the big benefits of public funding, is that, as you say, you don't have to subsidize those partners you want to work with, right? And you know, one of my favorite entrepreneurs said that if there's two of you with 1% market share, why are you fighting against each other? You should work together to capture the other 98% market share. There's no point of fighting over that. And I think, looking at this, this session is about talking about funding your growth. And I think what you've just highlighted here is that growth doesn't have to mean profit, right? I think, when you look at what, say, other types of funding may require, if you go down the venture capitalist route, the going towards IPOs and so forth, where it is more focused perhaps on revenue, profit, and customers, the more commercial acumen, growth might mean the improvement or increase in intellectual property. It might mean growth of the sector that you're in terms of, if you look at the quantum space, if you can improve the overall quantum market, that's going to benefit everyone playing in that space. Or growth might mean improving the capability of your organization so that the next phase might enable you to then, seek further funding, then to develop profit. I think, and is this the case here that public funding is the end of your funding journey, or at what stage do you say public funding is no longer perhaps appropriate for you? When should you stop at that point? Anyone have any ideas? Fiona?
So I don't think you ever stop looking at public funding opportunities, because as your business evolves, there are different ways, and you can get involved as a small player in a very big consortium. You can cement your relationship with, a blue chip FTSE 100 company through these kind of consortia. So I would say don't stop, but look for different opportunities as you grow, because with your business, you are always looking for growth. And that's the way I would see it.
I think there's something there, though, about at some point, it can't be, right, I've done this project with Innovate UK, so what can I do next that can get Innovate UK money? It has to be, I need public money because it fits with what I'm trying to do, and but at some point, as a company, you have to stand up. Okay, you have to stand up and go, right, I'm going to go sell my stuff. I'm going to go get myself a customer. I need some extra bank loans or investment because I need to go build a bigger shed because my order book's really booming. But at a certain point in time, for the idea that you were generating public funding to support you should really be mature to be in the marketplace and be able to stand up on its own. And you might come back for public funding to innovate further on that particular product. But I think the public funding, it shouldn't be a strategy to say, I'm going to live my life as a business just chasing public funding and co-matching the whole time. The whole point is that it helps you to grow and become the business, to employ the people, to sell your product, to sell your services.
So Celia, from an academic point of view, do academics even think about that? I guess you see Fiona and Ruth. Do academics think about, well, private funding should be a stage in the process? Or is it just, you know, the public funding that is always typically sought?
I think in terms of academics, it depends very much on the individual. You have academics who would love to, you know, develop their product and for it to go to market. And quite often that's what public funding is for, because the UK government want to ensure that all of the research that is done with their money is then accelerated to support the UK further in the future. So that's the main idea for it. But there are some individuals who just like, you know, doing their own little research, and they like their own research bubble. And that's when they might, for example, need a little bit of a push from a department, or maybe have a project manager say, hey, look, you know, your technology or your service or your product can be a very amazing thing. It could be something that's completely different to what's already out there on the market. And then that's when they might think, okay, maybe you should approach your innovations office within the institution, for example, and that might be like the first step for it to accelerate.
Yeah, it's to do with though as well where things are. So earlier, Johnny, you mentioned the amazing work nationally and globally on the vaccine research to, you know, help us with this pandemic and produce these vaccines. And people talk about how, oh my God, you know, how did we manage to get this research done so quickly? Because it's on a bedrock. It's on a bedrock of, like, you know, hundreds of years of research, 30, 50 years of deep research, often very curiosity founded of, I wonder if kind of questions that, you know, when something has to be come into focus, you know, it's on that platform of capability, which is why it's so important that the funding continues. The funding from government should be growing. I will make a pitch for that. I make no odds about it. You know, the government needs to be doing more on the innovation and research landscape of investments to secure our futures.
Can I also just pick up on something that Ruth said about the fact that, you know, you should at some point, when you've got your products developed, etc., you get, it sounds to me like, well, you get beyond public funding. The difference is that an R&D intensive organisation, whether it's academic or a business, actually doesn't get to a point where it has a product on the market, because it's always innovating and it's always got an innovative pipeline coming along. And the only time that it becomes self-sustaining is probably 20 to 30 years into its lifetime, when it starts to see a royalty stream from something it's licensed at an earlier point coming to market. So, and the only other route then is that company gets acquired. So that's why I think there is a difference with an R&D intensive business, that it doesn't matter how far into it. So GSK, for example, still does apply for government funding through some of UKRI's schemes, even though it's a FTSE 100 company.
I might be being slightly misinterpreted. So a lot of aerospace companies, Rolls-Royce, hugely R&D, BAE Systems, GKN Aerospace, all massively R&D focused companies. But at some point, some of that R&D translates into a product that is getting made. Okay, and they're not licensing the IP, they're making something and they're selling it. And that's where their revenue comes from. But likewise, the innovation around propulsion systems or novel materials for lightweighting aircraft will always continue, because they can always, you know, get it better. So there's this balance, but their whole strategy isn't to just live their lives on R&D funding. I think that's what I was trying to say.
That's a very good point, because
I agree with that. Yeah, I do agree with that, Ruth.
There is the point that, you know, your growth as an entrepreneur, as a startup, and bearing in mind that, you know, you don't have to be involved in a university to be a founder. You don't need to be a genius to be a founder. You can be anyone with an idea, really, and a solid plan. But the fact that your growth is often not always represented in a product, right? I mean, take Rolls-Royce, for example. They were the ones to start the whole power by the hour essentially as a service type of scenario that other manufacturers have since copied and has sort of replicated around. And so sometimes I think R&D funding and public funding allows you a little bit of breathing room to say, oh, I just need to determine, is this still the right track for me? Am I still going in the right direction? Whereas perhaps in other sources of funding, for example, if you see looking at seed equity, VC type funding, it might be pushing very much towards get something to market, get an engine made, get something manufactured, get a product out into where I can sell it, get customers. So I think it's trying to find that balance, isn't it, of where you are in your journey as an entrepreneur, as someone with an idea, as a project manager, a finance manager, for example, where your company is, what you're looking for at that time, and what do you need? What are you after? Are you after partners? Are you after a product? So we've talked a lot about, the successes, and all three of you are very successful. But what about failing? When we talk about, no one really wants to talk about failing when it comes to R&D, right? But the reality is that more things fail than they are successful. That's just the nature of it. We learn through failing. But is failure seen in a bad light when it comes to public funding? So as Innovate UK, as an applicant or someone thinking about public funding, if I failed with this idea 3 times in the past, should I stay away from public funding?
No, definitely not.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think it comes back to what we said earlier. You might have to tick some boxes in terms of the suitability or your eligibility for a certain type of scheme from whoever you choose to get your funding from. So whether that be a funder or a charity, or government funding, private, any of those types of things. And I think it's finding your fit specific to your concept or your idea or your product. And that's not to say that, there might be a case where perhaps you don't fully understand the funding landscape or your specific research area, in which case you don't realize that Joe Bloggs in another completely different applicant is actually applying for the same amount of money, but actually their idea just has that little bit more of an edge because they understand the research landscape better, and therefore they might have a better idea with respect to the reviewers who are looking at the bid or the application. I think I would also add that it's a case of practice makes perfect. So you might need a mentor to help you write the application in the right language for the specific funder that you're targeting. And that, sometimes it's just the smallest hurdles that can make you fail 3 or 4.
You're absolutely right, Celia. So, this is less about perhaps the idea, which may be sound, but the execution, isn't it? And Ruth, Fiona, you two must have had plenty of sound ideas or seen sound ideas in the past, but just the approach.
I think so. I think the approach to government funding so the language is really important. So one of the examples I often talk about is revenue. So revenue to government or impact to government is different to revenue and impact to the private company. So the company might be looking to increase profit margins, sort of reduce labour workforce through robotics, all those sorts of things. Government likes to see jobs being created, so it's about how do you marry that? And as you said, this is Innovate UK is research and development. Other parts of UKRI, like the research councils, so Innovate is part of that family, but the research councils do the academic piece, and they're about research, and Innovate is research and development. But it comes with risks because it's all part of research, and sometimes it doesn't work. And so those who are applying can get incredibly frustrated with the value for money process, because the value for money process will say, if this works, how many people would you employ? And, it's the engineers from the communities that I've been in working with, the engineers, very nervous about putting things down black and white and then being held to it. So it's trying to find the way through that landscape of saying, we forecast these kind of employment growth and these kind of market shares, but we recognise it comes with risks.
Yeah, and I think, one way that I get asked by a lot of people, what is the one thing that Innovate UK asks that other, or the government asks for funding that other funders don't ask? And I say, look, this is your tax money. Would you fund that idea with your tax money? Because we're all investing in you, essentially. There has to be some return for us. And, if you're going to be the next Elon Musk, the next billionaire, the next Jeff Bezos, the next whomever, and make all this money, why can't you do it yourself? Right? If it's going to make you rich, then why do you need public funding? And so, you're right, Ruth, this idea of jobs, although potentially not black and white, given the fact that we're looking at increased automation, robotics, which in theory might actually reduce initially the amount of jobs. So I think, asking that question and I guess speaking with, likes of yourselves, KTN, others that can help as well. But Fiona, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so just going back to your question about failure, one of the things I've always been impressed with, although I don't know how it is now recently, but certainly in past years, is that Innovate UK, UKRI give very good feedback when you're not successful. And usually you get to see reviewers' comments. And I would say that that's a really good guide to you to say, should I try again? Because it really does. And you do get very disparate views. You can get, scoring, and you don't see the scoring, but you can get scoring that's quite diverse. But I think you just have to take it on the chin, take the feedback, really work on that and address the weaknesses. So I think it's worthwhile trying again if you fail with UKRI for sure, because I certainly can see examples. And my other comment about failure would be that I have seen some appalling grant applications where people just haven't taken the time. So there is two extremes. One is you put in a really good grant application, but it has weaknesses, but you'll see what those weaknesses are from the feedback. So I wouldn't give up. To the other extreme, where you've got to take it seriously and you've really got to put the time and the effort in to make your grant application as good as you possibly can.
I don't know about you.
Sorry,
Celia,
go ahead, Bruce.
I don't know about you, Celia and Fiona, as well, that when you are talking to somebody who's applying for Innovate UK funding, how many times you've had to say, answer the question. Don't tell them what you want to tell them. Don't tell them what, a nice time you've had on your holiday and how important it was to you. Answer the question.
Yeah.
Answer what the question, and don't try to over read the question about, well, I think what they're really looking for is read the question, it's in simple language, and answer it. And that's one of my biggest things with people that I do work with is answer the question.
Yeah. And that's, they have to do this within the word limit that's available as well. I think one of the other things that I would add is that answer the question is very important. But I think that, you have to think about how many times you're going to put essentially the same concept into funders. So I have seen so many applications from the same individual group of individuals, which is essentially the same idea, and they've copied and pasted it and they rehashed it. And I appreciate why many people do this, because there can be a small percentage of success. So I can understand why you might tend to want to apply to different funders to try and increase your likelihood of success. However, you really do need to put the time into thinking about how you want to answer the question specific to that funder within their remit, within their scope, within their strategy plans that they will have them all online. You have a look and see how you fit, how you can tailor your research to fit. And it might be, something very different from energy to looking at something in biology, but, they're always looking for interdisciplinary research because you get more bang for your buck. So if you can find a way to write it creatively so that you tick a lot of boxes, you're halfway there.
I think the language.
I agree with you, Celia. Absolutely.
So I think the language here is important, right? And the nuances between the language required by the government, public sector applying compared to academia, compared to a pitch, a 60-second elevator pitch that you might do for private funding versus, a discussion with some mates down at the virtual pub, wherever that might be. So, and that's often quite clear, is that while you want to make, you want to convince people that your idea has merit, making very broad general statements as in this will change everyone's lives for the better may work well on your friends and family, but to the government, to someone that is looking for detail, does not provide that level. And I think, when we look at the details of funding their growth, people say, but it's a great idea. And I'm sure it is, but what's behind that initial sort of statement of here's what we're trying to do? What's it's behind there? What is the team like? What is, how are you managing the risks? And I guess I actually want to look at team, because, we've talked a lot about individuals here and what they should be looking at. But how important is the team behind you, or that team that supports you, whether they be internal, your existing team, mentors, advisors? What role should they play when it comes to looking at how you achieve funding next? Ruth, what would you advise people on if they came to you?
So I guess because I'm sorry, I default to aerospace because that's where space, and so the vast majority of those businesses are do work in a very collaborative way with Innovate UK. And so the team element there from an Innovate UK perspective is to see the customer in the loop. So, because you're talking about stuff that might be still 8 and 10 and 15 years away from market, what that consortium needs to articulate is the customer, and there are very few top level customers in aerospace. It's the Airbus, it's the Boeing, it's the Rolls-Royce, that kind of thing. And then articulating where their connection with them is there a letter of support? Are they mentoring you in the project? Quite often some of these bigger companies will act as a mentor in the program, or maybe they're actually in the consortia directly. So the team element can be not just be, I think if you're a startup and you're a micro SME, I think understanding where you've come from to Innovate UK is really important. Mentored by the chief exec of XYZ, but the team of your consortia can be hugely insightful to Innovate UK in terms of the richness of that program.
And Fiona, you must have worked with some pretty exceptional teams at Point. What would you advise?
So if you are a small part, i.e. the small in an SME, then the challenge you've got is that your core team that you employ is probably very small. But obviously their experience is absolutely critical. So how you then build a team around that is impressive for any form of funding is through your board members. So I think working hard to make sure that you've got the right chairman and where you can influence it, the right non-exec directors is really important because that brings you a lot of expertise. And then the other is your advisors. So and I guess the other skill as a small business is how you can get people to give you their time and give you value for money, because you can't afford to spend a huge amount of money on that advisory and board side of it. So that's how I build out a team at the early stages. And I think it's a very good point for most early stage businesses.
And Celia, coming from the academic side of things, I'm assuming that typically what will happen is that you'll have a whole bunch of academics and with dozens of PhDs between them all. Is that, do they miss business skills? Do they miss sort of the, I suppose I had to say, the slightly more real world sort of project delivery skills when it comes to these sort of things? Or can you have, as for example, can you have too many academics in one project where it actually becomes too much fundamental research focused?
I think it's really up to the group to decide if they've got too many individuals in terms of academics and their skill set. If you've got two very complementary individuals, for example, or two very complementary groups, then great, they can work together really well. And you might find that, a big group might decide that they want to break off and put two competing applications in, or to apply for different schemes because they fit better. And that's not a terrible thing. In terms of them, academics not necessarily having kind of business skills, it's not something that either can't be learnt or can't be fixed. So I've been part of projects before where you have a brilliant mind in terms of the science, the technology, or whatever they're researching. However, they are not tailored to maybe the business side. And that's where you just employ a project manager. And it's finding, like you said, the right individuals, the right team to work together to make sure that you can go forwards in the same direction.
And that's a very good point, because ultimately, when you're submitting an application to Innovate UK, for example, it's often not just one person writing it, isn't it? It's often several people that are contributing and getting that consistency across. And also, I think, making sure that you answer the questions within the questions, right? So Innovate UK we give you very broad questions to answer, but then sub questions within that, and the approach around that. And I think, often what I'm hearing is that either with yourself, your team, your partners, it's really important to make sure that you have a cohesive answer that is easy to read, that is as clear as can be, that answers as many of the questions as possible. But I guess a question to you all: at what point do you realize maybe I'm not best to be the lead on this. Maybe I should be the collaborator. Are there any indicators?
The thing that's just popped into my head as well, actually, that I do say to people when writing is, one, forget about the word limit, just write. You can cut down later. And the second thing is, write what you need to write and then give it to somebody who is not doing the project. Okay, give it to somebody in marketing, in comms, with a strong marketing and comms background, because they can help, clean, the comments come through on the chat box that, the questions aren't always simplistic. And I'm coming from a perspective that I've answered these quite a few times. So, I think if you're coming at it new, you're right. They are very broad. And, you're dealing with something very specific in a technology or a product or a service, and you feel flummoxed, quite frankly. But just write it all down. Don't worry about your word count, write it, then try to put it down. And then I think that one of the best things you can do is to then hand it to somebody who doesn't really know your project and your consortia and have them read it for you and then almost redraft it.
That's really good insights. And I think, one of the comments coming through is, mentors are fantastic, and especially a mentor that could also potentially read this for you and give you some advice. But paying for them, you're a pre-revenue startup. You are, not even paying yourself a salary. There's no money coming in. How do you engage a mentor, especially one, so let's say of caliber of the three of you, how would they go about approaching you?
I must admit, I've had people just contact me out of the blue and ask me if I'll mentor them, as opposed to, obviously being engaged by organisations to mentor. So I think you always judge it on the basis of, each individual, I guess, opportunity as it arises. But equally, as I've founded and grown businesses, I have gone to people and asked for help when I've not had any money to pay them and not been able to promise anything in the future. And I've been amazed at how much people will help you. So I think if you don't ask, you don't get. It's the first bit of advice. And the second is, that individuals like us will always judge things according to where we are and what we're doing at the time.
There's also a wealth of information out there. I mean, you can look at successful grant applications. It's not like, once you've been successful in a project, you're going to hide it so no one realizes it exists. You can look and see who has been successful. Potentially there might be like a blurb or something online that you can see part of their application. You can see the caliber of what they do and see if your research matches or is on par with the successful applications that have already been there. And that's also, the case for identifying the individuals who might be able to help you, like you've said.
I think you should ask KTN myself.
Actually, speaking of that, the KTN actually has worked with us at Innovate UK. There's on social media some, I think, top tips for writing a grant application and keeping it nice and clear about what you put in each of those sections. So I think Siobhan and others might be able to put that in the comment section below. I think it will be somewhere down there maybe. So hopefully you'll be able to find that. I think looking at it, I guess a big part of being a mentor, being someone that can provide advice is, if you are going to approach a mentor, make it clear what you're asking for, isn't it? As opposed to, could you be a mentor and then ask them to review business plans, review application forms, review finances, everything else just becomes too much. And I think, that does put people off, like yourselves, from actually responding to those requests on LinkedIn or email or wherever they come from. So I think, making it clear, I'm after you as a mentor because I, would value experience in the field of aerospace and biotech and quantum or research or whatever it might be. So I think, being quite clear about that is quite good. So that's the good application guide that Siobhan has just mentioned to me, available probably via Google. So let's look now at, I guess, at the practicalities of this. You're now deep in the funding side of your project. But let's look at cash flow and the expectations of money. So we have talked about funding, but in reality, a lot of people are actually talking about money, right? We are talking about cash in hand, cash in the bank to pay things. What are some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to, handling public money? It might seem like, all of a sudden I've got, especially with some of the programs that, Innovate UK have done recently, where there's been a large upfront payment. sometimes £50,000 up front. What do you do with this cash, and what are the expectations of public funding when it comes to this money, this influx of money that you've now gotten? Is this like a line of credit? Should it be treated, as like petty cash? And what is the reality of it being in a project, having to do research, trying to manage the cash? Because, let's say you've got £1 million R&D project, of which Innovate UK is giving you 700K. What are the practicalities and the realities of managing that amount of money over a period of time? Fiona, have you had that experience?
I've always been scrupulous about this from a personal perspective. So for me, cash flow, I've managed research intensive businesses. Cash is king. So I manage cash very carefully. I always have cash flows which are updated, if not monthly, fortnightly, depending on where you are. The reporting for my Innovate UK grants has always been that you're operating within defined limits. You can't suddenly spend all the money on something you haven't said you'd spend it on. And I think Innovate UK also has a very good system where if you get to a point in a grant where you suddenly realize you've got to change the way that you spend money, you want to spend less on X and more on Y, you can go to them. It's a fairly slick process, takes time, but you can get an agreement to change how you spend the money. But I don't find it restrictive, but I think it's really important. And I have got examples of others who don't manage their grant money well. And I think the risk is that Innovate UK, I don't know if they've ever done it, but they do have the right to claw back the money if you don't spend it correctly. So personally, from a business perspective, I think it's really important to manage your cash properly.
But so Johnny, you can clarify this. Innovate UK is retrospective, isn't it? So you spend money and then you claim it back. You spend and claim it back.
It has been previously, but we have now actually started providing cash up front. So I mean, COVID has shown that working capital is important. To ask a business to go 3 months now with their own cash is tricky when there is no future revenue or their revenue has dried up. So things like the continuity grants, we paid 90% of their grant up front, right? 90%. So that means a lot of cash into people's banks. And so managing that and being good at that does require a certain set of skills, right? So just because you are great at R&D and great at the technical doesn't mean that you need to forget about the sort of the day-to-day operational aspects of that as well too. I mean, Celia, in the research community, I suppose it's a little bit less of a concern, isn't it? Because it's sort of the university with its pools of resources that can handle and absorb that.
Yeah, so we usually get the money up front because otherwise, you can't keep the lights on, as simple as that, or have the power to power the labs. But there is a case for, you can always pull in extra finances should you be on a project that has a commercial partner, for example, and you might have a discussion with them to see whether there is any flexibility in how they provide resources, whether it be in cash or in kind.
I mean, you must see that a lot, Ruth, in the aerospace, right? So the leaning on the Boeings, the Airbus, the Rolls Royces, and the fact that I suppose it could be daunting as an SME, a sort of pre-revenue, wanting to work with a Rolls Royce Airbus where the project is in the millions, and you're just looking at your balance sheet.
I think, not everything in aerospace is in the millions, and not everything starts in that space. So, I think there are some bigger challenges to get into aerospace than there are necessarily about affording a multi-million-pound grant. It's a really high barrier to entry sector. The knowledge of the regulations, the understanding that it's a very conservative sector. You're flying people around. Safety of every aspect of an aircraft is at the top of every list. So I think that cash flow thing, there are other programs have also helped, like the contingency loans because of the pandemic. The sharing in growth, for instance, is a wholly separate program for aerospace supply chain companies to try and equip them for the future, to stabilize them, to get them back focused. And it comes back to, if you're getting a bank loan or you're getting a loan or a grant from Innovate UK, you are spending somebody else's money. So you should treat it like it's your own.
Yeah.
You know, if you treat it like it's your own, you're probably going to look after it really, really well, you know. And, you know, my understanding is that all the processes are in place for good reporting, quarterly reviews, you know, quarterly reports. You've got monitoring officers who you can phone and go, OMG, I've just been on a spending spree and I went a bit mad in the labs, and you know, you can pull it all back. You know, you can have that conversation. Innovate UK's door is my feeling, my experience of them over the last 15 years is your door is always open for a conversation.
And you know, speaking from Innovate UK's point of view, we would rather not take that money back. Right, would rather you spend the money on doing what you want to do as appropriate. And I think, you know, to your point, Ruth, that you're right. In the aerospace, not everything is building planes. Right? At some point, it's systems, it's materials, it's the small things. It could be logistics and supply chain efficiencies within that as well too. And I think a comment from Wendy on YouTube is that, you know, sort of the smaller size of business that secured funding. One. a single person, zero revenue. In fact, sometimes when they apply to us, they are pre-company's house registration. They haven't even registered their business, but they've been successful in that sense. And it's not necessarily about the size of the business that determines your success. It's about how you get that idea across. And I think another comment there around small founders who are struggling with resources, right, and spend time on the application. One of the things that will get people applying for funding is to rush, is to look at, the deadline's in 2 days' time. I think I can make it. And you spend the next 2 days, you know, day and night, sleepless days, sleepless nights, and just unable to get it done in time. And it becomes a poor application. So I think reaching out and taking your time, I think, is probably one of the best things you can do. Speaking from those that have done that, those that have experienced, this is not a light decision. Is that right? Is it fair to say that going for public funding or any sort of funding, whether it be a loan application or whatever else might be, it's not flippant, is it? It's not something you think, just do it tomorrow and away I go.
Yeah, I think COVID has been a bit different. You know, some of the COVID grant deadlines are really short, in 2 weeks. So I think we need to make a distinction there that you do that's quite challenging. And the way that where I've been involved, we've addressed it, is there's been quite a big team of us to put that together. So that's really hard for a small organization to deal with. But other than that, you're absolutely right. You've usually got about 2 months. And my view has always been, and I think it picks up on something that Ruth said as well, which is, you know, you don't leave it to the deadline. So my deadlines are always the week before submission. At that point, you've got an absolutely finished grant application. And that's the point where you might send it to someone who's a bit outside of your field to do that last sanity check and read it, but never submit on the day of the deadline. Submit the night before. I mean, I always submit at 10, 11 o'clock at night, the night before, because internet traffic's usually quiet. If there's any problem uploading, you'll see it. You know, give yourself time to get that last bit right. It's just so important.
So I've run some fairly large competitions in the last 6 months, and in almost all of them, the last 60 seconds of the deadline, so between 10:59 and 11, I think the most I saw were 11 applications submitted within those 60 seconds. I mean, you are asking at times for hundreds of thousands of pounds. Why would you leave it to chance? Because at 12:01, in terms of the seconds, at 12 o'clock exactly, it's done, it's finished. We won't accept it anymore. So it is frightening how many people leave it to the very end. Yeah. And I think going back to a resource point of view, if you are struggling with resource in terms of just even writing the application, I appreciate that obviously COVID, some of them have been quite quick, but if you are struggling just to get the time and the resource, maybe delivering that project at that point in time may not be the right time for you if you can't fully resource that, right? I appreciate that it can be chicken and egg. You need the money, the grant funding to get the team in place, but maybe it might be just taking a step back and understanding that.
I would say as well, I think COVID has been, you know, exceptional in so many ways. And so your grants have been, but in a normal world as well, you know, if you're leaving it until the last minute, you know, it's very rare that you get a decision within the next 2 weeks from Innovate UK. You know, if you're relying on this to be doing something with any kind of urgency, that's why you're applying last minute, and you're looking at the wrong pot. You know, the decision making around some of this stuff can take 3 months, you know, and then you get your conditional offer letter, and you've got another 3 months to go sort out your lovely consortia agreement, your chit chat about IP, which always goes pear-shaped, and you know that stuff can take another 3 months. So from your submission date, it can be at least 6 months before you start the work.
So Ruth, what is your top tip then? Ruth, what is your top tip? And just finally then, when it comes to getting funding?
My absolute top tip is get somebody in marketing and communications to read your submission.
Perfect, thank you. And Fiona, for you, top tip?
So my top tip always is read the guidance and use it as almost your script. You have it there, and I go through the guidance and I check every sentence and make sure that I've answered all the questions. It just never fails.
Brilliant, fantastic. And Celia, your top tip?
So definitely, you know, we've just discussed, make sure you plan ahead. Don't rush your application. Make sure you've got the right individuals, even if that's your admin team or the individuals who are doing the research. That's really important. And I think that I would also add that, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a brief conversation prior to that to say who might get what section of each pie, because like, you know, like Ruth has said, when you have that stamp of approval and it goes into IP talk, it can get very messy. And then all of that effort that you've put in, it's just gone down the drain if you don't come to an agreement. So it's worth touching on just to see.
Fantastic. So there you go, folks. That has been the top tips from the experts and myself. So hope you enjoyed that. And Siobhan, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Yes, so I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists, Fiona, Celia and Ruth, and also for Johnny for their expertise and their thoughts and just sharing all of their experiences with us. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us online today. On it next, Let's Talk About webinar is taking place on the 10th of March, where Jenny Tooth, CEO of UK Business Angels Association, will be joined by some more fantastic panelists to talk about pitching to investors. So we hope that you can join us then. And we'd also like to invite everybody online with us today to celebrate International Women's Day with us on the 8th of March. We have a full day of workshops, panel discussions, roundtables, and some absolutely incredible speakers. So do please sign up and join us on the 8th of March to celebrate. If you'd like to keep up to date with all the Women in Innovation news and events, please do sign up to our newsletter or visit our programme page or join the LinkedIn group. And once again, I'd like to express a massive thank you to Johnny Bloom for hosting the wonderful session today, our 3 fantastic panelists, and to you all for joining us. And I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye, everyone.